The city of Boston hummed with its usual rhythm on the evening of November 15, 2022. In a quiet, upscale apartment in the heart of the bustling metropolis, Ethan Grant stepped out of the elevator and walked toward his door. A chill lingered in the air, not unusual for a late autumn evening, but something felt off. He paused at the threshold, fumbling with his keys, as an unsettling silence greeted him. Typically, his wife Emma would call out from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warmth of familiarity. Their 2 children, Sophia and Jacob, would be giggling or squabbling, filling the home with a comforting cacophony. But tonight, nothing. "Emma," he called, stepping inside. No answer. The soft thud of his briefcase hitting the floor echoed eerily as he scanned the living room. Everything appeared in place, the neatly arranged furniture, the faint smell of lavender air freshener. Yet the silence gnawed at him, setting his heart pounding. Ethan moved further in, his footsteps hesitant. The children were spending the night with their grandmother, a rare evening alone for Emma. But where was she? His eyes flicked to the kitchen. Empty. The bathroom. Empty. A creeping sense of dread began to tighten his chest. As he approached the bedroom, his breath hitched. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness beyond. Pushing it open, Ethan froze. On the floor lay Emma, her lifeless body twisted unnaturally. Her golden hair was splayed across the rug, her face contorted in a grimace of pain. The room was in disarray, the nightstand overturned, drawers pulled open, and their contents scattered. A broken lamp lay shattered by the bed. Nearby, her phone lay in pieces. "Emma." Ethan's voice cracked as he dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulders desperately. "Wake up. Emma." But there was no response. No pulse. Only the cold stillness of death. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911. "My wife, she's not breathing," he gasped, his voice a mixture of panic and disbelief. "Please. Send someone now." The operator's voice was calm, steady, trying to anchor him amidst the storm of his emotions. But Ethan's mind was a whirlwind. Who could have done this? Why? Minutes later, the faint sound of sirens pierced the stillness of the night. Red and blue lights flashed outside the apartment complex as uniformed officers and detectives swarmed the scene. The once peaceful apartment was now a hive of activity, with forensic experts dusting for prints and photographing every inch of the room. Detective Charlotte Hayes, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, stepped into the bedroom. Her gaze swept over the scene, her expression unreadable but intense. "Who found the body?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding. Ethan, seated on the living room couch with his head in his hands, looked up as an officer gestured toward him. His eyes were red, his face pale, and his fingers clenched tightly together. "Mr. Grant," Charlotte began, kneeling to meet his gaze. "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to walk me through what happened tonight." I don't know," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking. "I came home, and she was, like that. She was fine this morning. I don't understand." Charlotte's gaze didn't waver. "Was the door locked when you got home?" "Yes," Ethan replied, his brow furrowing. "There was no sign of a break-in. Someone she knew must have," his voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Charlotte's sharp mind started piecing together the scenario. No forced entry. A struggle evident in the state of the room. This wasn't a random attack. It was personal. As the hours wore on, initial reports began trickling in. There were no immediate signs of theft, Emma's jewelry was untouched, and cash in the dresser drawer remained. Yet, the broken phone near her body raised questions. "What's on the phone?" Charlotte asked one of the tech analysts. "It's smashed, but we're working on retrieving the data." "Could take a few hours," the analyst replied. In the meantime, the investigators turned their focus to Ethan. Statistics and experience told Charlotte what the data often showed: in most domestic homicide cases, the spouse was involved. "Mr. Grant, where were you this evening before coming home?" she asked, her tone firm but not accusatory. Ethan inhaled sharply. "I was working late in Cambridge. My boss can confirm." "Did you and Emma have any recent arguments?" "No." Ethan snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I loved my wife. Why would I ever?" Charlotte studied him carefully. His anger seemed genuine, but years of experience had taught her that appearances could be deceiving. "We'll need to verify your alibi," she said simply, rising to her feet. As Ethan's protests faded into the background, Charlotte's mind churned with unanswered questions. Who had been in that room with Emma? And why did it feel like this case was only beginning to unravel? Twist: while reviewing initial evidence, Charlotte discovered a cryptic text sent from Emma's phone hours before her death. The message, sent to Ethan, read, "If anything happens to me, you'll know why." Charlotte stared at the screen, a chill running down her spine. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a story steeped in secrets. The morning of November 15, 2022, began like any other in the Grant household. Emma Grant, 36 years old, had gone through her usual motions, preparing breakfast for her children, Sophia and Jacob, while her husband Ethan rushed to get ready for work. The bright kitchen buzzed with activity as the children chatted about their day ahead. "Don't forget, Mom, we're staying at Grandma's tonight," Sophia chirped, her wide smile showcasing a missing front tooth. "I know, sweetheart," Emma replied, smoothing Sophia's hair. "You and Jacob be good, all right?" Ethan entered, grabbing a cup of coffee. "I'll be late tonight. Big deadlines at work." He leaned down to kiss Emma on the cheek, but she turned her face slightly, letting him kiss her temple instead. He hesitated for a moment but said nothing. Emma watched as Ethan hurried out the door, the sound of his footsteps fading in the hallway. She sighed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as the children darted into the living room. It was a routine she'd grown accustomed to, a routine that felt more like a performance with each passing day. From the outside, the Grants were the picture of a perfect family. Ethan, a dedicated accountant in his late 30s, worked hard to provide for his wife and children. Emma, a full-time mother, kept their upscale Boston apartment immaculate and their lives running smoothly. Sophia, 8, and Jacob, 5, were bright, well-behaved children who adored their parents. But perfection often hides the deepest fractures. Emma felt trapped in a role she had never fully chosen. What had started as a love-filled marriage had slowly turned into a partnership of convenience. Ethan's long hours at work and focus on financial security left little time for emotional connection. Emma spent her days caring for the children, keeping the house in order, and playing the role of the devoted wife. But inside, she was suffocating. It started innocently enough. A package arrived at the door one day, a simple delivery. The man on the other side was Ryan Archer, a 25-year-old Amazon driver with a quick smile and an easy charm. He handed Emma the package, their eyes meeting for a brief moment longer than necessary. "Thanks," Emma said, her tone polite but distant. "No problem," Ryan replied, flashing a grin. "Let me know if you need anything else." The next time he delivered a package, the exchange was longer. They spoke about trivial things, the weather, Boston traffic, the holidays. Ryan was charismatic, attentive, and, most importantly, he noticed Emma in a way she hadn't felt noticed in years. What began as casual conversations at the doorstep turned into longer, more personal exchanges. Emma confided in Ryan about the monotony of her life, about feeling invisible in her own home. Ryan listened, his gaze intense, as if she were the most important person in the world. It wasn't long before their meetings moved from the doorstep to the living room. Emma justified it to herself, it was harmless. Ryan was simply someone who made her feel alive again, someone who reminded her of the woman she used to be. But Ryan didn't see it that way. For Ryan, Emma was more than a passing infatuation. She was the answer to his own loneliness, his own yearning for connection. Raised in a broken home and struggling to find stability, Ryan had always craved the kind of life he imagined Emma represented. To him, she was perfect, beautiful, kind, and vulnerable in a way that made him feel needed. Ryan began rearranging his delivery schedule to ensure he'd pass by her building. He memorized the times Ethan would be away and found excuses to linger. Emma, at first flattered, started to feel uneasy as his attention grew more intense. By early November, Emma knew she had made a mistake. What began as an escape from her suffocating life was spiraling into something darker. Ryan's texts became more frequent, more insistent. "Can I see you tonight? I miss you. You don't belong with him. You belong with me." Emma tried to pull back, to create distance. But Ryan didn't take no for an answer. "I can't keep doing this," she finally texted him on November 10th. Ryan's response was immediate. "You don't mean that. You love me." "I'm serious, Ryan. It's over. You're not leaving me. We're meant to be together." Emma's heart raced as she read the words, a chill running down her spine. She blocked his number, but the sense of dread lingered. On the morning of November 15th, after Ethan left for work and the children headed to their grandmother's, Emma spent the day trying to distract herself. She cleaned the apartment, reorganized the pantry, anything to keep her mind occupied. But when the doorbell rang that evening, her heart sank. She opened the door to find Ryan standing there, his face a mixture of desperation and anger. "Ryan, you shouldn't be here," she said firmly, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind her. "We need to talk," he insisted, his voice low and tense. "There's nothing to talk about. It's over." But Ryan's gaze darkened. "You don't get to decide that." Emma's breath caught as he pushed past her into the apartment. As the bedroom door closed behind them, their voices rose in argument. Emma stood her ground, insisting that it was over, that she wanted to fix things with her family. But Ryan's desperation turned into fury. "You're lying," he shouted, his hands trembling. "You don't love him. You love me." When Emma reached for her phone, Ryan grabbed it, smashing it to the floor. The argument escalated into chaos, the room a blur of movement and sound. It wasn't until much later, when Ethan opened the door to their apartment and called out her name, that the silence of what had occurred finally settled in. In the days following Emma Grant's death, the lives of those around her began to unravel. The secrets she had worked so hard to keep hidden surfaced one by one, shedding light on the fractures in her seemingly perfect world. The people closest to her, Ethan Grant, her husband, Ryan Archer, her lover, and Rachel Steele, her best friend, were pulled into the orbit of the investigation. Each had their truths to face, their lies to confront. For Ethan, the shock of discovering Emma's lifeless body was only the beginning. As he sat in the sterile confines of a police interrogation room, Detective Charlotte Hayes studied him with quiet intensity. "Mr. Grant," she began, her voice steady, "we're trying to understand what led to your wife's death. I need you to be completely honest with me. Were there any problems in your marriage?" Ethan blinked, his expression one of disbelief. "Problems? No, we had our moments like any couple, but I loved Emma. She was the center of my world." Hayes raised an eyebrow, her pen tapping softly against her notepad. "Did she feel the same way, do you think?" The question hit him harder than he expected. Ethan's gaze dropped to the table, his mind replaying the subtle signs he had ignored, the way Emma had grown quieter in recent months, the nights she seemed distant even when they were together. He had chalked it up to stress, to the demands of raising their children. "I thought she did," he whispered, the words feeling hollow. Meanwhile, in Lowell, Massachusetts, Ryan Archer sat in his dingy studio apartment, staring blankly at his phone. The news of Emma's death was everywhere, her picture flashing on the screen with headlines that spoke of tragedy and mystery. Ryan's hands trembled as he scrolled through the articles, his mind racing. He remembered the last time he saw her, the anger in her voice as she told him it was over. "It's not over," he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible. For Ryan, Emma had been more than an affair. She had been a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a life filled with disappointments. Abandoned by his parents as a teenager and shuffled through foster homes, Ryan had always craved stability, love, and acceptance. Emma had given him a glimpse of that, even if it was fleeting. But when she tried to end things, his desperation turned into obsession. Rachel Steele sat in her living room, gripping her phone tightly. She hadn't slept in days, her mind replaying every conversation she'd had with Emma in the weeks leading up to her death. "Rachel, I don't know what I'm doing anymore," Emma had confessed one evening, her voice trembling. "I feel so trapped. But there's someone who makes me feel alive again." At the time, Rachel had urged caution. "Emma, this isn't you. Whatever you're feeling, you need to talk to Ethan. Don't let this spiral out of control." But Emma had waved her off, insisting it was just a phase, something she would figure out on her own. Now, Rachel couldn't shake the guilt that clawed at her. Could she have stopped this? Could she have saved Emma if she'd pushed harder? As she stared at the photo of Emma on her phone, Rachel's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Detective Hayes. "Ms. Steele," Hayes said, her tone firm but not unkind, "we need to talk about your friend Emma." Detective Hayes had seen her share of domestic disputes turn deadly. In her 15 years on the force, she had learned that the truth was often buried beneath layers of lies and omissions. From the moment she stepped into the Grants' apartment, she knew this case was no different. The lack of forced entry suggested Emma knew her attacker. The state of the room, a clear sign of a struggle, indicated someone who had been in close proximity. But the broken phone near Emma's body held the most intriguing clue. When the tech team retrieved the phone's data, Hayes found a string of text messages that painted a very different picture of Emma's life. Among the messages were exchanges with Ryan Archer, a name that hadn't come up in any of the initial interviews. The texts were intimate, emotional, and increasingly erratic in tone. "I can't keep doing this," Emma had written on November 10th. Ryan's response was almost immediate. "You don't mean that. You love me. We're meant to be together." The final message from Emma to Ryan sent chills down Hayes' spine. "It's over, Ryan. Don't come here again." This revelation turned the investigation on its head. Hayes had initially focused on Ethan as the prime suspect, his emotional outburst, his insistence that he had no idea what had happened. But the texts pointed to someone else, someone with a clear motive and a growing obsession. As Hayes stared at Ryan's photo on her computer screen, a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was something far darker. Back in his apartment, Ryan's desperation grew. He couldn't stop thinking about Emma, about the way she had looked at him the last time they were together. "She didn't mean it," he muttered to himself, pacing the room. "She loved me. She said she did." But deep down, Ryan knew the truth. Emma had chosen her family over him. And that choice had sealed her fate. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of the Boston Police Department's interrogation room, casting long shadows on the walls. Ethan Grant sat slouched in a metal chair, his tie loosened, his face pale and drawn. Across from him sat Detective Charlotte Hayes, her sharp eyes watching his every movement. "Mr. Grant," she began, her tone measured, "let's go over this again. What time did you leave work last night?" Ethan exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "I told you, I left around 7:15. Traffic was terrible getting back from Cambridge. I got home just before 8 o'clock and found Emma. His voice cracked on her name, and he cleared his throat. That's when I called 911. Hayes nodded, jotting notes in her leather-bound notebook. Her pen tapped lightly against the page as she asked, "And your relationship with Emma? How would you describe it?" Ethan hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "We had a good marriage," he said finally. "Of course, we had our disagreements, but nothing serious. She was everything to me." Hayes didn't flinch, her gaze steady. Was she happy? The question landed like a blow. Ethan opened his mouth to answer but stopped. For the first time, he seemed unsure. His mind flashed back to the moments he had brushed off, the nights she had gone to bed early, the times she had seemed distant, distracted. "I thought she was," he said softly, his voice barely audible. Despite Ethan's seemingly genuine grief, Hayes couldn't ignore the statistics. In most domestic homicide cases, the spouse was involved. Ethan's emotional state and the lack of forced entry made him a natural suspect. Back at the crime scene, the forensic team uncovered additional clues that deepened the mystery. Emma's jewelry and cash were untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her phone, though shattered, had revealed text messages pointing to an affair, a revelation Hayes had yet to confront Ethan with. Meanwhile, Hayes's team dug into Ethan's financial records. They found something surprising, a series of recent withdrawals from a joint savings account he shared with Emma, totaling over $10,000. "What's this about?" Hayes asked Ethan during their next meeting, sliding a copy of the transaction records across the table. Ethan blinked, confusion giving way to defensiveness. "That was for the kids' college fund," he said quickly. "Emma and I had talked about it. We wanted to get ahead on expenses." Hayes leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "That's a lot of money to pull out in such a short time. And Emma never mentioned it to anyone." Ethan shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. "I don't know what to tell you. I didn't kill my wife, detective. I loved her. You're wasting time looking at me when the real killer is out there." While suspicion lingered over Ethan, Rachel Steele, Emma's best friend, provided a critical turning point in the investigation. Summoned to the precinct, Rachel arrived visibly shaken, clutching a tissue as she recounted her final conversations with Emma. She wasn't happy, Rachel admitted, her voice wavering. She felt trapped. Like she was just going through the motions for Ethan and the kids. But she never stopped loving them. Hayes pressed gently. "Did Emma ever confide in you about anyone else in her life?" Rachel hesitated, her fingers twisting the tissue into knots. "There was someone," she finally said. "A man. She didn't tell me much, just that he made her feel alive again." "Do you know his name?" Rachel shook her head. She was careful. "I think she felt guilty, but she couldn't let go. The last time we talked, she said she was trying to end it, to focus on her family." Tears welled in her eyes as she added, "She was scared, though. She said he wasn't taking it well." Hayes exchanged a look with her partner, a silent understanding passing between them. The breakthrough came when Hayes confronted Ethan with the texts uncovered from Emma's phone. "Do you recognize this number?" she asked, sliding a printout of the messages across the table. Ethan frowned, his eyes scanning the page. "No," he said, shaking his head. "What is this?" "It's from a man named Ryan Archer," Hayes replied, her tone steady. "He and Emma were having an affair." Ethan's face turned white, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma would never." "She was trying to end it," Hayes continued, her voice softening slightly. "But it seems he didn't want to let her go. He's now a person of interest in her death." The words hit Ethan like a freight train. He sat back in his chair, his chest rising and falling as he tried to process what he had just heard. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he loved, had been hiding an entire part of her life from him. As the pieces of Emma's secret life came into focus, Hayes's team began tracking Ryan Archer. They discovered delivery logs showing his frequent visits to the Grants' apartment, often when Ethan was at work. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras confirmed Ryan's van had been parked near the building on the night of Emma's murder. Meanwhile, Ethan's grief turned to anger. "How could she do this?" he said bitterly during their next conversation. "I thought we were happy. I thought we had a life together." Hayes didn't respond. She had seen this before, the shock of betrayal, the layers of guilt and regret. But she also knew Ethan's pain didn't make him innocent. The turning point came when Hayes pieced together a timeline of Emma's final hours. The messages, the surveillance footage, and Rachel's testimony painted a chilling picture of Ryan's growing obsession and Emma's desperate attempts to cut ties. Ryan Archer was no longer just a shadow in Emma's life. He was now the prime suspect. But as Hayes stared at the evidence, a nagging thought lingered in her mind: was this truly the whole story? Or was there another secret waiting to be uncovered? The chill of November deepened as Detective Charlotte Hayes pushed forward with the investigation. Each piece of evidence unearthed seemed to hint at something darker, more tangled, than a simple crime of passion. Ryan Archer, Emma's secret lover, had become the prime suspect, but Hayes knew better than to jump to conclusions. People's lives weren't neat little puzzles, they were messy webs of secrets, lies, and hidden desires. In her years as a detective, she had learned one truth: it wasn't just about what people did, it was about why. Hayes's first stop was Ryan Archer's workplace, the Amazon distribution center in Lowell, Massachusetts. She stood outside the nondescript building, watching delivery vans zip in and out of the loading docks. Ryan, a young driver with a clean record, had seemed ordinary on paper. But in person, he was anything but. When Hayes called him in for questioning, Ryan arrived looking disheveled. His eyes darted nervously, and his hands fidgeted in his lap. "Ryan," Hayes began, her tone firm but calm, "we've been going through Emma Grant's phone. Your name came up quite a lot." Ryan stiffened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I don't know what you're talking about." Hayes leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "You don't? Because these messages paint a very different picture." She slid a stack of printouts across the table. "It seems Emma was trying to end things with you. And you didn't take it well." Ryan's face flushed. "I loved her," he muttered, his voice cracking. "She said she loved me too. She wasn't happy with him, with Ethan. She deserved better. Did you think you were the better option?" Hayes asked, her voice now cutting. "That she'd leave her family for you?" Ryan's breath quickened. "She told me she wanted to," he snapped, his voice rising. "She said she couldn't stand living with him anymore. But then she changed her mind," Hayes pressed. "She tried to end it. That must have hurt." Ryan slammed his hands on the table, his composure cracking. "She was scared. That's why she said those things. She loved me, she was just afraid of what he'd do." Hayes studied him in silence. Ryan's words were filled with conviction, but his emotions betrayed a different story: a man losing his grip on reality, spiraling into obsession. Back at the precinct, Hayes pored over Ryan's delivery logs and social media accounts. It didn't take long to find troubling patterns. Ryan had rearranged his delivery routes to visit Emma's apartment more frequently than his job required. His Instagram was filled with cryptic posts about love and heartbreak. One particularly chilling caption read, "When you know someone's your destiny, you don't let them go. Not without a fight." "He's been watching her," Hayes murmured to her partner, Detective Sam Morales, as they sifted through the evidence. "This isn't just infatuation. It's obsession." "What about the camera footage?" Morales asked, pulling up a video file on his laptop. Hayes leaned in as the grainy footage played. It showed Ryan's van parked near Emma's building on the night of her murder. The timestamp read 7:42 p.m., 18 minutes before Ethan claimed he arrived home. That puts him at the scene, Hayes said, her voice low. And his alibi? Non-existent, Morales replied. Meanwhile, Ethan Grant grappled with the revelations about his wife's affair. The knowledge that Emma had betrayed him cut deeper than he could have imagined, but what haunted him more was the thought that he hadn't been enough for her. She didn't just cheat, he told Rachel Steele, who had visited him after being questioned by Hayes. She lied every day, right to my face. How do I live with that? Rachel, racked with her own guilt, struggled to find the right words. She loved you, Ethan, she said softly. I know she did. She felt lost. Ethan's expression darkened. She should have talked to me. She should have told me instead of, he trailed off, his fists clenching. Rachel placed a hand on his arm. Ethan, this isn't your fault. It's Ryan. He's the one who couldn't let her go. But Ethan wasn't so sure. The anger simmering inside him made it hard to see anything clearly. As the investigation zeroed in on Ryan, Hayes received an unexpected call from the forensic team. They had recovered a second set of text messages from Emma's phone, messages sent to an unknown number the night before her death. The messages were brief but chilling. I think he's watching me. I don't feel safe. Hayes's pulse quickened. Was Emma referring to Ryan, or someone else entirely? To make matters worse, a fingerprint analysis from the broken phone revealed two sets of prints, Emma's and an unidentified third party. Could it be Ryan's? Morales asked as they reviewed the report. Hayes shook her head. Maybe. But if it's not, we might have another player in this game. As Hayes prepared to bring Ryan back in for further questioning, a bombshell landed on her desk. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Ryan filling his van with fuel on the night of Emma's murder. The timestamp, 8:12 p.m., placed him away from the scene after the estimated time of death. Damn it, Hayes muttered. He's obsessed, but this footage might give him an out. Unless, Morales interjected, he had an accomplice. As the puzzle grew more complex, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was still missing. The way Emma had lived her life, compartmentalized, layered with secrets, suggested that there were more pieces waiting to be uncovered. Her gut told her that Ryan wasn't the only danger Emma had faced. Keep digging, she told Morales. Emma wasn't just afraid of Ryan. There's someone else out there, and they're not done hiding. Detective Charlotte Hayes had been here before, the edge of revelation, the moment when everything began to unravel. But this case was different. Every layer peeled back revealed another secret, another complication. Emma Grant's life had been anything but simple, and her death felt like the tip of an iceberg threatening to sink everyone involved. Now, with the mounting evidence pointing at Ryan Archer, Hayes prepared for what she hoped would be a decisive interrogation. Yet a nagging feeling lingered, telling her that the story wasn't quite finished. Ryan sat in the interrogation room, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. His disheveled appearance spoke volumes, hair unkempt, dark circles under his eyes, and the twitch of a man unraveling. Across from him, Hayes placed a folder on the table and flipped it open, revealing photographs of Emma's apartment, her shattered phone, and the grainy surveillance footage of his van near the scene. Ryan, Hayes began, her voice steady but sharp, we have enough to place you at Emma's apartment the night she died. The camera footage, the text messages, it all lines up. You need to tell me what happened. Ryan's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table. I already told you, he said through gritted teeth. I didn't hurt her. I loved her. Hayes leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. If that's true, then prove it. Because right now, everything points to you. Ryan's resolve cracked. His breathing grew shallow, his fingers digging into his scalp. "She didn't want to leave me," he blurted, his voice rising. "She said she couldn't keep living with him, with Ethan. She wanted to be with me. Then why did she try to end it?" Hayes countered, her tone ice-cold. "Why did she tell you to stay away?" Ryan slammed his fists on the table. "Because she was scared," he shouted. "She thought he'd find out. She thought he'd hurt her." Hayes didn't flinch. "And what did you do, Ryan? When she said it was over? When she tried to push you away?" Ryan's body sagged as if the weight of the truth was crushing him. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I just wanted to talk to her. To make her see we could be happy together." "Did she agree?" He shook his head, tears spilling down his face. "No. She said she loved him. That she wanted to fix things with him." His breath hitched, and he covered his face with his hands. "I lost it. I couldn't let her go. I grabbed her. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to stay. But she kept fighting me. She wouldn't stop." Ryan's words dissolved into sobs as Hayes watched him, her expression unreadable. The room felt heavy with tension, the air thick with unspoken truths. "Ryan," Hayes said softly, "you killed her." He nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I didn't want to. I loved her. I still love her." Ryan's confession seemed to tie the case neatly, but Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. The second set of fingerprints on Emma's phone and her cryptic text, "I don't feel safe," nagged at her. Ryan's actions were those of a desperate man, but Emma's fear had been more widespread, as if she were looking over her shoulder for more than just one person. Hayes returned to her desk, pulling up the recovered data from Emma's phone. Among the deleted files was an audio recording Emma had saved the day before her murder. Hayes clicked play, her stomach tightening as Emma's voice filled the room. "If something happens to me, it won't just be because of Ryan. I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to fix them. Someone else knows. Someone who's been watching me." Hayes froze. Someone else. The fingerprint analysis finally came back, and it was a shock. The second set of prints didn't belong to Ryan Archer, they belonged to Rachel Steele. Hayes's pulse quickened as she pieced it together. Rachel had known about the affair, about Emma's feelings of dissatisfaction in her attempts to end things. But what had started as guilt and concern had grown into something darker, a simmering resentment. Rachel had been there for every tear-filled confession, every moment Emma doubted herself. And yet, Emma had turned to Ryan, not her. Hayes drove to Rachel's apartment, her mind racing. She found Rachel sitting at her kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "You found it, didn't you?" Rachel said quietly, her voice steady. Hayes nodded. "I did. Emma trusted you. Why would you?" She was throwing everything away, Rachel interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. Her marriage, her kids, everything she had built. For him. And she didn't care what it did to the people around her. "I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen." "What happened that night, Rachel?" Hayes asked, her tone soft but firm. Rachel took a shaky breath. "I went to her apartment to talk some sense into her. I didn't mean for it to happen, but we argued. She said I didn't understand, that I couldn't possibly know what she was going through. And then she told me she was going to leave everything behind, for Ryan." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. I couldn't let her destroy her life. I didn't mean to hurt her. But she kept screaming at me, and I lost control." Ryan Archer had killed Emma, but only after Rachel Steele had left her bruised and broken. Rachel had started the chain of events, and Ryan had ended it. Both had acted out of love twisted into something unrecognizable. Hayes leaned back in her chair later that night, the weight of the case pressing down on her. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would last a lifetime. Ethan Grant, left to pick up the pieces of his shattered family. Rachel, facing the consequences of her betrayal. And Ryan, sentenced to life in prison for a crime born of obsession. In the end, Emma's secrets had unraveled not just her own life but the lives of everyone around her, a haunting reminder of the fragile line between love and destruction. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the judge's gavel echoing through the chamber. Ryan Archer, once a charismatic delivery driver with dreams of something more, now stood shackled and pale as he was sentenced to life in prison. His face remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his guilt and the crushing reality of what he had done. In the gallery sat Ethan Grant, his expression unreadable. The months since Emma's death had been a blur of grief, anger, and unanswered questions. How could the woman he loved so deeply have hidden so much from him? And how could her life end so tragically, entangled in a web of lies and betrayal? For Ethan, moving forward felt like an insurmountable task. The home he once shared with Emma now felt hollow, a painful reminder of the life they had built, and the secrets that had torn it apart. The laughter of his children, Sophia and Jacob, was the only thing keeping him grounded, but even that was tinged with sorrow. Late at night, Ethan often found himself sitting in the living room, flipping through old photo albums. Images of Emma smiling, holding their children, or standing beside him at their wedding felt like snapshots of another life. She wasn't perfect, Ethan admitted one night to Detective Charlotte Hayes, who had checked in on him after the trial. But none of us are. I just wish I had known how much she was struggling. Maybe I could have done something, said something, to change all this. Hayes, sitting across from him with a cup of coffee in hand, nodded thoughtfully. We all think that, Ethan. That one word, one action could have stopped something terrible. But the truth is, Emma made her choices. And so did Ryan. All we can do now is learn from it and make sure the people we love know they can come to us. Meanwhile, Rachel Steele faced her own reckoning. Though her role in Emma's death hadn't led directly to charges, the truth had destroyed her carefully constructed world. Friends turned their backs on her, her career faltered, and the weight of her guilt followed her everywhere. I thought I was helping her, Rachel told her therapist in one of their sessions. But I wasn't helping anyone. I just made it worse. The loss of Emma haunted Rachel. She avoided the places they used to frequent together, but every now and then, she'd see a woman with blonde hair and a warm smile and feel her chest tighten. Emma was gone, but the consequences of Rachel's actions would linger forever. Back at her desk in the Boston Police Department, Detective Hayes reviewed the final case file for what felt like the 100th time. The facts were laid out neatly, the timelines precise. Ryan Archer had confessed, Rachel Steele's involvement had been clarified, and Emma Grant's story had reached its conclusion. But Hayes couldn't shake the lingering emotions. Emma's case wasn't just another file to her, it was a mirror. Hayes had seen parts of herself in Emma, the silent struggles, the unspoken desires, the moments of feeling trapped. Her own strained marriage weighed on her as she thought about how easily cracks in a relationship could widen into chasms. That night, Hayes went home to her husband with a renewed sense of purpose. They sat down and talked, really talked, for the first time in months. Emma's funeral had been a small, somber gathering. Friends and family huddled together, whispering about the shocking details that had come to light. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was also a quiet resolve among those who had loved her. For Ethan, the service was a turning point. He stood at the front of the room, his children at his side, and spoke not just of the pain Emma's choices had caused, but of the joy and love she had also brought into their lives. She wasn't perfect, he said, his voice steady despite the tears. But she was ours. And we'll always love her. As the months turned into years, Ethan began to rebuild his life. He focused on his children, pouring his energy into giving them a sense of stability and hope. Slowly, he started to heal. Emma Grant's story was one of love, betrayal, obsession, and tragedy. It showed the fragility of human relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. But it also carried a lesson: the importance of communication, honesty, and recognizing when help is needed. Detective Hayes would often think about Emma's case, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the complexities of human nature. Behind every headline was a deeply personal story, one that deserved to be told with empathy and understanding. Now, as the final chapter of Emma's story comes to a close, we turn to you. What do you think about Emma's choices and the tragic consequences that followed? Do you believe Ethan could have done more to save their marriage, or was Emma's fate inevitable? What about Ryan and Rachel? Were their actions driven by love, or something darker? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective on this haunting story of love, secrets, and betrayal.